I'm Piper. I was class of 2020. I went to law school right out. I was an international studies major. I was a poli-sci concentration, which was phased out when I was there. So I know that doesn't exist anymore. But that's what I did. And when I was at BC, I was in the Bellarmine Law Society. I was really involved in Eagle Month, the student-led Model UN program. Then I also was a peer advisor in the IS department. And yeah, I went to law school right after undergrad. So I graduated this past April. I'm Canadian, so I went to law school in Canada at home. And now I work at a corporate firm downtown Toronto. And we do like full service corporate law, like big law is what they call it in the US, I guess. And I focus mostly on litigation, employment, and general corporate litigation.
Thank you so much. Nicolas, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Nico, class of 2019. So I took a year off between graduating from BC and going to law school. So if we want to touch on that later, I'd be happy to. I actually did the Jesuit Volunteer Corps for a year in Chicago, which is where I ended up going to law school at the University of Chicago. So I also just graduated this past year. While at BC, I can't quite remember the combination of words. I was like IS with like applied ethics or something like that. It was sort of the sub-concentration, and then I minored in philosophy. I was heavily involved in OLA, the Organization of Latin American Affairs. I did some counseling, the Thea Bowman Center. I did Big Brother, Big Sister. And I currently I'm doing what's called a postgraduate fellowship year, which the term fellowship means different things in different sort of realms of academia. But for a law school fellow, I'm working as a public interest attorney for an NGO called Reprieve. And Reprieve is based out of London, but I'm working for their DC office, and I'm working on indefinite detention in Syria. So it's human rights work, which I'd be happy to talk about later on.
Hi everyone, my name is Anxhela. I graduated BC in 2017 and then went directly to law school, so a little bit different. Happy to speak to that later. In law school, I specialized in environmental law, so I chose a law school that focused on that. At BC, I studied both environmental geoscience and international studies, and then my minor was political science with the IS major. And I'm really fortunate enough to work in the climate and energy space. So I'm a public interest attorney for an NGO based out of Boston called Conservation Law Foundation. So that was really the reason for me to go to law school and to focus on my legal career was always to work on climate issues. And with that, at BC, I worked for UGBC. I created the Environmental Caucus, which was a representative body of environmental organizations. So we held like one of the first Earth Day fairs at BC and did some other type of advocacy work within the student government. And outside of that, I played violin, so I kept busy doing that. I'd have to think about the other things that I was involved with at BC, but those were some of it. And then during the summers was able to do some research outside of BC, but in the environmental science space.
That's awesome. I work in the with environmental sustainability in UGBC right now, so it's kind of awesome that you kind of started that. So that's awesome. So I guess if you guys could just start off by I know you gave kind of a little bit of what you did in undergrad, but did you guys all already know you wanted to go to law school as soon as you got to BC? Did you pick some extracurriculars to kind of help you navigate that, or to just augment maybe your application, or you were looking ahead? If you could just talk a little bit about that, or maybe even internships that you guys did, just to give us kind of an idea of where you guys were at in undergrad.
Am I starting again? I can go. I think I knew I wanted to go to law school for a while. I loved the IS major. I did debate doing a master's of public policy or something similar to that to kind of keep an academic stream similar to IS. And I will say, the participation and like really interesting topics and discussions we would get into in IS classes is something I missed in law school, because I think especially your first law school year can be very like learning the principles of the law, and you kind of do less of that like independent discussing. But I'm happy I went to law school. And when I was in when I was a junior, I did the BU Geneva internship program as my exchange. I'm not honestly sure if it's still around, because I know BC kind of cut some of the non-BC sponsored exchange programs. But when I was in Geneva, I worked for an NGO called International Bridges to Justice that did legal access work. And so I got to work with them for a couple of months when I was on exchange and go to the UN. And that kind of cemented my interest in definitely going to law school. And that was kind of one of the cores of my law school application.
Thank you.
I can,
Either one of you guys, yeah.
yeah, I can follow in the sequence. So it's sort of hard to actually, I struggled to like access my mind while I was at BC in terms of like knowing how explicitly I was committed to law school. I know it was probably, I think at the moment that I was in school, it was the most likely outcome for me, but I don't remember myself being singularly focused on it. I knew I wanted to work in the human rights space, and that's why I chose the international studies major. And I think it served me really well as giving me the sort of the academic foundation for then that I was then able to kind of spring off of in law school. But I actually, if you look at my resume, it doesn't really suggest that I was going to go to law school. It was a lot of service. It actually suggests more that I was going to do like education. I did a lot of work with ESL students. I did a lot of like sort of mentoring programs through Big Brother, Big Sister, which I loved. It was probably one of my favorite things I did at school. The only thing that was truly legal that maybe tipped my hand a little bit was my senior year. I worked for the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau. So senior year, I think I like cut my classes down, and I would spend maybe 2 days a week. I would take the bus over to Cambridge, and I would work in one of their clinics, which I actually highly recommend for anyone who is looking into their senior year, has that kind of that Friday off or that Monday off, starting to integrate like a more regular presence in the clinic. I think at least having one thing that speaks to law, it doesn't need to be that you're like in pre-law. It doesn't mean that you need to be sort of at every step along the way strongly signaling to eventual law school, hey, look, I was on the board, I was on the train since day one. That's actually absolutely not necessary. And doing the Jesuit Volunteer Corps actually in a non-legal position was also something that I never actually felt like it wasn't a detriment. In fact, it was actually a positive for me to come at it from like a different angle. I was an immigrant caseworker, which was a more natural extension of what I'd been doing in BC than actually law school. But doing things that feel meaningful to you in a service-oriented format, if that's something that you feel called to do, if you feel called to do something else, don't shoehorn anything that doesn't feel natural or desirable. But only the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau was actually truly the like obviously law related thing that I did. Everything else was interests that I had or service opportunities that I wanted to do. So it wasn't a straight shot, I guess, is my takeaway.
Yeah, I'll echo Nico's remarks. And I completely agree that I don't think you have to be on a pre-law track before law school. In fact, I would almost suggest doing other things outside of the legal framework, because I think those are the types of skills that will prepare you well for law school. As I stated before, I was an IS major, but also an environmental geoscience major. So I spent times in labs, working with climate scientists, and really it was just great to be around those types of professionals just to gain the scientific background in order to do the work that I do. I had a few different internships I worked at. One was an environmental NGO, just doing some policy work. Another was a lab. And I think the takeaway that I kept realizing was that a lot of policymakers, even negotiators at the UN, if that's what you want to do, or advocates, are lawyers. They have a legal degree. And to me, in the beginning, I kind of, I did a pros cons list, which maybe is a sign of a legal mind maybe, but I just looked at different ways of using kind of like a law degree. And I think it opens up a lot of doors. You can practice with it, you can teach with it, you can do writing, and essentially, especially if you're working at an NGO, you're doing a lot of policy work as well. And so those decisions definitely solidified, the push to just pursue the legal field above all. I will say, if any of you are interested in environmental law, sometimes you get a very traditional view of what an environmental lawyer does. So when I was at BC, I took the environmental law class that BC law students teach to undergrads, and I took that my first year, and I was super excited and did well. But again, you learn kind of traditional environmental law statutes, and especially now doing more climate and energy law, there's a lot more beyond that. So it may be easy to get discouraged if you focus too much on the legal kind of nuances early on. But if you stick with it, you're able to find your niche. So for me, it was always kind of law school seemed like the end all be all, but I wanted to explore other things along the way. And I definitely enjoyed doing that.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting, guys, that just like there is so many different paths into law, and you don't have to have like 3 legal internships before you get into it. Because I think like a lot of students do think that, so that's super helpful. In terms of, okay, you guys, eventually figured out you want to go to law school. Some of you already knew from the get-go. How was that application process like for you? And I know, Piper, for example, you went to Canadian law school. I don't know if you applied to any American law schools, but if you could talk about if you know of any differences, but otherwise you can speak to your own experience. But just how was your application process? Did you have any resources at BC that were helpful to you? Did you do it all on your own? Like, how did you find it?
I think someone else start, because I'm not sure I'm going to be super on point with the applications.
I can start. So I took a year off to do this full-time service program, which was an interesting experience because it had shades of working full-time, because I was a full-time caseworker, like JVC by design, with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. Actually, I'm speaking as if people are guaranteed to know this, but it's basically like an AmeriCorps year. So you get placed, you live in a house with 5 other people, 3 other people, 8 other people, sort of an intentional living community, and then you like work in like a sort of socially oriented workspace. So I was working a 9 to 5 that then started to stretch into a 9 to 6, then a 9 to 7. So I had that sort of sense of like, okay, I'm applying while working, but also JVC is a year. And so the program, I think, is intentionally oriented towards people who are then going to go to grad school. So for people who are taking time off, one thing that I will say is that the application is not only just sort of like a tough amount of work, but it's sort of there's like an emotional, intellectual like space that it starts to take up. So I think if you can afford it, taking 1 or 2 months off between these different steps of your life can make a big difference. Sort of in those transition moments from maybe undergrad to starting a job, if you're not going to go straight through, or between jobs, or looking forward to law school, if you can save up a little bit of money and take a month off when you're not working, I think that ends up making a big difference, because it can start to blur. Like you get home from work and you're tired, and I'm sure students, you understand this like sense of having to be on 24/7. That can happen with applications as well. But in terms of like the nitty gritty, I applied to about 12 schools, I think. And with law school, it is somewhat similar in that you have this like distribution curve of schools that like you think that you're more likely to get into, and then these edge schools. And I'm sure that there's a lot of really good materials online, so I won't get into like the strategy of it because it's not super fresh in my head anyway. But I ended up getting into, of those 14 schools, like about 3 straight out, and then there was a bunch of wait lists. And it just so happened that of the 3 that I got into straight up, the one that I really wanted to came up positive. So I can't really speak to that. Like there's that strategic period of being on the wait list and sending letters, and that maybe someone else could speak to that if they went through that experience. But it's a numbers game, and it can be really difficult emotionally because people with perfect grades and perfect 180 LSAT and they started a NGO that cured cancer, like will not get in, and for reasons that are completely opaque. And that can be a very frustrating experience when you know that you're just sort of submitting yourself to a statistical process and all you can do is try to give yourself the best number of dice to roll, but beyond it, there's no guarantees, which is both, I think, difficult to accept, but also is a little bit liberating because it then opens the possibilities as Angela and I were speaking to, like doing something that doesn't have to do with law and pursuing an interest that takes you to the destination that, you can't guarantee it. So because you can't guarantee it doesn't mean that you have to do the paint by the numbers route to law school. I have students who are classmates in law school who are like who were opera singers for a couple of years. Someone was an artist, someone, I don't know, she like specialized in scanning the interiors of cathedrals to then make these 3D mock-ups. Like it is anxiety inducing, but I think it can also be liberating in that there's just not one optimal model of getting to law school other than getting good grades and doing well in your SAT. Like those are the two things that are the biggest determinants. But outside of that, like, live your truth, because that actually might be the thing that pops off the page more than someone who tried to box themselves in and like tried to do the thing that they thought they had to, and maybe left some things on the table. But yeah, if there's any more questions, I know it's a big topic to address, and I don't want to take up too much time. But if any of that is particularly interesting, I can talk on it later.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in next. I did have to apply, or I wanted to apply as I was in school, just because taking a gap year, I mean, it seemed exciting, but I think, finding then a 1-year job or, not having a job just wasn't didn't also seem that feasible. I needed to do something as a next step. So what you can do, I would say, I don't know what years you all are, but there are certain things that you can get done beforehand. Like the process in and of itself, I think with just online applications is somewhat straightforward because, you're having your resume needs to be done. You have your personal statement, which you can begin as soon as possible. And for me, I knew what I wanted to write about just because, climate issues meant a lot to me. So I obviously knew I wanted to lead with that in my personal statement. And then you submit your LSAT scores and your GPA is in your resume. And I believe you have to have a few letters of recommendation. So, and again, all of those you could get started on as soon as possible. So I think if you plan it well, it's definitely possible to apply during school. I mean, it is a lot of work, but it's kind of that checklist mentality of, it could seem really like a huge mountain, but if you just, carve like 30 minutes a day, it ends up not being as big of a task. And I think that's the way that I tried to handle it. But law school admission, it is I think the result of it is the kind of stressful process, right? Because law schools just place such an emphasis on LSAT score and just like the numbers of it all. But I do think things work out the way, they work out eventually. Maybe you won't go to your dream school, but maybe you'll go to another program that has a specific concentration that's really exciting. Or, I do think sometimes there's benefits to going to schools that have specialized programs, because you could really take advantage of all of the opportunities at those schools, whether it's a federal clerkship during a semester, or running your law review, or being your professor's like lead research kind of assistant. So just don't get too dissuaded by the process if you don't end up getting into that top school. But the cool thing with law schools is that you can kind of negotiate a little bit when it comes to the wait list or getting off the wait list. I know for me, after I will say, I don't know if Nico and Piper agree with this, but I think you should definitely take the LSAT twice. I feel very strongly about that. Financial, like law schools do give quite a good amount of financial aid. There were people at my schools that had full rides essentially, and that happened after their second LSAT scores. So if possible, take the LSAT again, submit that second score, see if they'll give you a full ride, tell the other school you got a full ride, and then see what you can do. Because I was on the phone with some deans of certain law schools and talked to them, and then ended up making my decision about where I went on a variety of factors. So on to you, Piper.
So the similarity, I mean, to be honest, it's not that different of a process between Canada and the US. I think more so I just don't have like a great basis to discuss like law schools in the US because I didn't apply to any, but the process is the same in terms of letters of recommendation, resume, LSAT, personal statement, all of that's the same. I would also say for letters of recommendation, like just because that hasn't been touched on, I think that's like a strategic point. I think being able to show like multiple parts of yourself, if that makes sense. So like I had one from a former boss, and I had one from Professor Erickson, because I just loved her at BC and she was my advisor and I'd taken a bunch of her classes and I felt like she could kind of speak to me academically. So I had kind of that balance between, because I think law school is professional school. So it's a little bit different than an undergrad as like personal statement where you're going to talk about how you want to grow as a person. Like professional school, you're ultimately talking about what sort of lawyer you want to be and how you're going to make your mark as a lawyer. So I think being able to show kind of different parts of yourself, and that could be an interest of yours and an area of academia that you really enjoy, a job you loved. I think like being able to show different parts is great. I also took the LSAT twice. I took it senior year. I also, because I was a 2020 grad, I wasn't actually 100% sure I wanted to go straight through, but I took the LSAT because I had this idea that I was in the studying mindset. So I may as well take the LSAT while I was still studying, which I did the same thing for the bar. So I think that's a good tip generally. But I took it senior year and thought, okay, I'm just going to apply. Like I'm happy with my score. Let's just see what happens. And then I was so lucky I did because I was going to teach overseas. That was my plan in between. And I wouldn't have been able to do that during COVID. So I was very lucky that I had gotten into law school and then taken that step. So I would also say, I mean, just write the LSAT kind of as early as you want. I know people who wrote it like the summer between sophomore and junior year. Like if it's not on your mind, it's not on your mind, but it's never too soon to start studying and give yourself some time to bump up that score if you want to.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really nice just hearing the different ways you guys went on about that. So it's really nice and helpful. I guess going off of that, how did you guys ultimately make your decision on which law school you wanted to go to? If you could touch on that a little bit.
Okay, I'll go quickly. Different, but there's not actually that many law schools in Ontario, and I want to go to a school in the province. I wanted to, like, I'm from Toronto, want to go to school there, so I'd be called in the province. Not that many law schools, applied to a bunch. The waiting game is the same. I got into 2 fairly early, and I just decided I didn't want to play with. I wasn't even on a wait list. It's more so like they just roll the admissions up until August. Like if they still have spots, they're still rolling. I know people who got in 3 weeks before law school started, but I was happy with the 2. One was in the city, one was a little bit further outside of the city. I decided I kind of wanted that BC campusy feel. So I went to one outside of the city, and I really liked it. So worked out.
Yeah, I chose my law school one just because they ended up having a really strong environmental law program, and then for financial reasons, the scholarship was really hard for me to give up. They also had unique dual programs with Yale as well, and LLM programs in case I wanted to practice abroad. So I ended up doing my JD and LLM at Pace, and then there were just some really cool international again internship opportunities. So a practicum with the UN where you got to go to the UN during General Assembly week. So that truly was a highlight. I had so much fun during September, which should maybe seem like a crazy semester month, but it was so great for PACE students because we got to roam through the General Assembly while everyone was there negotiating. But I was really between law schools. There were a few in DC that it was hard for me to give up just because Pace is in White Plains, and I wasn't really excited about going from Boston or from Chestnut Hill to White Plains, was not enthused about that at all. But that's where you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons. And then I graduated in 2020 and then was able to move out and am back in Boston now. But it's hard to find like the most perfect ideal situation, but you do get to make the most of it. And then I ended up interning in DC one summer. So then I still kind of got that DC experience.
Yeah, as I alluded to, I guess I was blessed to get into a small number of schools that I liked that then made the waitlist game not such an active part of my like thinking process. But I one thing that I can share is that if you look at their websites, like a lot of law schools start to bleed into each other. They highlight the same things. I mean, one law school to the next is not that different. It's sort of like these marginal differences or these like differences in their ability to sell themselves to the public. But like in of itself, like law school is sort of a fixed experience, especially that first year. And so the thing that I looked for to differentiate was the clinical programs. I knew that I wanted to have a really strong practitioner education. I knew I wanted to do human rights law, which is like a little bit of a niche in that not every school has a clinic program dedicated to international human rights law. So I actually ended up using that as my heuristic. I mean, you can go any number of ways. You can look at faculty, see if someone's worked in something that is like really meaningful to you by city. Some city, some schools place really well in particular geographic areas. So as Piper was saying, like if you have already a strong fixed set of like where you want to live and make your professional career, that is a big determinant. I was ambivalent about where to be. I just was more connected to the idea of being in human rights law. And it just so happened that Chicago at the time had a professor, Claudia Flores, who was Latina, which was important to me because there's not that many Latinx people represented on faculties. And she was the head of the International Human Rights Clinic, which I just really greatly admired their program and their sort of framing of human rights law as something that could also include domestic issues. So working on police brutality in the US and things like that would normally fall outside the ambit of human rights because of sort of like an in to out orientation that's often taken. But yeah, clinics I think is really where you can see like where they put their money, where their mouth is. Like how do they support clinics? How are they spoken about? Especially something like environmental law, I'm sure. Like who are the clients that they're working with, the causes that they're taking up. Like that was the same for human rights. And then frankly, because I wanted to do public interest, I had to really pay attention to what's called the LRAP program, which is that different schools offer different internal programs to support public interest students who are going to be entering lower paying careers. And I have a massive amount of loans. I just do. And I was ready to, my financial situation from undergrad allowed me to take on those loans in graduate school. I know not everyone can do that. And it's a very complicated personal question, but Chicago protects me basically. If I earn under $80,000 a year for the next 10 years of my career, they will pay my federal loans. And that was huge. I needed a school that was willing to do that for me and to give me that flexibility to enter a riskier, lower paying career. And there's different ways to pay out your loans. Some people will go into big law and a fixed amount of time, pay down their loans and switch over to public interest. I'm not going to go into all of those things, but that's something that I would recommend everyone look into. How, if you're interested in public interest law, how do they handle your debt?
Yeah, or financial aid scholarships. That's why it's important to apply to schools with specialized programs as well, rather than just focusing on applying to like Columbia or Harvard or Georgetown. So
Thank you guys. That's super helpful. I think absolutely it's so easy to like not know where to start and just be like, oh, like the big names, like absolutely. But yeah, I've also like looked into a lot of like um all the different payback or just merit or not merit scholarships or just like scholarships for students who are interested in public service and stuff. So that's really fantastic that you highlighted that and just to look into the specialized programs as well. What about like when you guys were in law school, like did you guys spend a lot of time doing different extracurriculars? Did you focus on your academics? Like how was your law school experience?
I think people give really mixed opinions about kind of how to spend, especially your first year at law school, because ultimately a lot of jobs start recruiting really early in law school, and your first year grades do stand as your most important. And I think that's like, I have to admit, it was a little bit of a hard pill for me to swallow, because I think, especially at the beginning of BC, I was very much like freshman year, just exploring, trying new things. Like, ultimate GPA was not the top of my mind at the beginning of undergrad, whereas in law school, it kind of has to be. Honestly, I think regardless of what you both can speak to this, but regardless of what you want to go into, you want to have yourself primed with good grades that allow you to walk in that door to show why you should get that job. I honestly did a lot of extracurriculars, but it was COVID. I had literally nothing else to do. So I was on like the Canada US Law Institute. We did research projects. I was on the International Law Review Board and I wrote articles. I was a pro bono caseworker for criminal law, which is funny because I haven't done any criminal law since, but it was a very cool experience working with people in the community. And then I will say, like, you just have to make sure you're balancing that with feeling like you're getting your work done, because I think it is an adjustment. It feels like a lot more work, not to scare anybody. You get used to it, but I think there's like a great balance there between finding things that will propel your interests, show you what you're interested in the law, while also allowing you to feel like you can kind of adjust to what life as a law student is like.
Yeah, I can get in here under the wire with the 2 minutes. I struggled to connect the academic component of law school for many reasons, which aren't worth going into right now. But in the classroom, I think I had a harder time than some of my peers, like feeling engaged. And that was a shock to me after having such a good experience in the IS program at BC, where I felt like all the time, like, wow, that's such an interesting discussion. Or I think especially referencing values, like a value-based orientation, not that it was like we had to agree on it, but like sort of referencing something outside of the law as like a normative endpoint, like what does the law serve, rather than it just being studied as like a closed system of logical principles or something, where people, I think, could generate some really strange ideas about humanity in such an environment. So the way that I felt like I could kind of tap back into that humanist tradition that I felt like I really enjoyed at BC was through clinical education. Being in a clinic was the most important thing for me. Granted, the first year you can't, at least at Chicago, you can't be. So I kind of had to like hunker down and survive that first year until that summer. I ended up working for the Human Rights Clinic, and ever since then, that was like my main. I was like willing to like not even study to go do my clinic work. Like that's how much I loved it, and it was such a beautiful experience for me, and it set me up for the career that I'm like building out now. So yeah, clinics were really special for me, and kind of I think helped me develop a more rigorous sense of what I wanted to do.
All right, it's going to cut us off soon. So if you guys could just join back at the same link, I'm very sorry.
Yeah, so I agree with what's been said. First year is definitely a year to just focus and kind of just get through it, because your GPA does really matter that year, and especially if you have a scholarship, usually you have to maintain a certain GPA for that scholarship. For PACE, it was really tricky because the average was below the GPA cutoff, so you really had to constantly be at the top of your class. I think the GPA cutoff, which doesn't seem crazy right now, was I think a 3.0, but most people were getting a B minus, which is below that. So be mindful that law school, you are graded against your peers. So only a certain percentage are going to get kind of the top grades, and it's all one final. So there's no kind of, paperwork or discussions or, any, other contribution besides like a 5-hour exam per class at the end of the semester. So that is the part of law school that first year I really found so frustrating, because I always loved school before that, and just did not love that everything was riding on a few exams. Needless to say, if you kind of survive first year, it's great. And I definitely really got to enjoy some unique internship experiences. So I think I mentioned before that I spent 2 semesters at the UN. I did one in the one summer and then a fall. and then took advantage of externships outside of that. So PACE had an externship program with different judges that were in New York. So I got to work for the Southern District of New York. I spent a semester doing that, which really was just good legal experience in terms of legal research and writing. And then I spent a summer in DC. I was at the DOJ for one summer, which was also great. And then during my time at PACE, I worked with a few professors and did different research papers for them and different research assignments. And that really helped me because then I graduated law school in 2020, which was not an easy time to graduate. So while I was studying for the bar, which also was kind of a nightmare during 2020, I was helping a few professors publish a book. And that was just because of some of the research experience that I had done during my time at PACE. And then I obviously got to talk about that during my job interview. So take advantage. I would say it's okay first year if like you're really just focusing on classes. I do truly recommend that. But after that, you don't only have to take summer internships or work at firms during the summer. You can also just take advantage of semester opportunities. And even if you don't end up working for a firm, it's not the end of the world. I ended up working for a firm right outside of law school, not having that prior experience, and was still hired and then ultimately joined the company that I'm at now. So, really the important thing that I think even like semester internships, so firms as you're a student and then as you're graduating, what they're really looking for is the legal skill set, which you're going to get in any forum. You can work for an NGO or a government agency, or, even a research professor. You're going to be kind of utilizing the same legal skills, which is research, writing, drafting, public speaking. So if you can talk about that and just talk about how that skill set translates, I think you have a good shot at really getting the position that you ultimately want. However, I think, Piper, you may have mentioned this, but obviously a lot of law firm recruiting does happen first year. So if you're really looking for those top law firms like straight out of law school, it may, you do kind of have to get into that narrow window, but lateral transfers, so working for a few years and then going to those firms is always possible. So it's always possible to make it happen.
Thank you for that. How about like once you guys got out of law school, did you guys have an idea of what you guys were going to go straight into? Is a position, I know you just spoke about that you were at a different firm and now you're at the NGO. If you guys could just talk about like kind of your career trajectory. I know Piper and Nico just graduated, so I'm assuming you guys have just been at the same place. But if you guys could talk just about how you got that position, whether or not it relates to IS, if you're utilizing the same skill sets and things like that.
So I interned at the firm I work at now between second and third year of law school. My job the summer after law school, I did some research for a professor, and then I also just did some kind of like part-time work for an employment lawyer who also did some labor work, which I didn't have a lot of experience with, which I really enjoyed. And then I went through the recruiting process. It's really early, but I mean, you're kind of in it. I knew that I was just going to kind of apply to a bunch of the bigger corporate firms and kind of figure it out from there. So I wasn't super picky with where I was applying to be honest. Ended up here, and I really liked it throughout the interview process. So I was very happy with that. And then I worked last summer, finished my third year of law school. Now I work here. And I have kind of figured out as I've gone, I think that's like one of the nice things I will say about working at a firm that does a lot of different things, like a place that does full service work is there's a lot of practice groups here. And there's a lot of different types of law represented. I mean, like there's some cool ones. I mean, like commercial litigation and employment are basically everywhere, but like we have aviation law here and sports law and like Caribbean offshore investment law. And so who knows, maybe I would have liked one of those. So I think that's kind of maybe one of the benefits, like you're committing early. I was beginning of second year of law school, but always room to try new things. And as Anxhela said, like lateraling is very common. Like you are not stuck anywhere that you commit to early. And I think just getting those foundational legal skills gives you a lot of opportunities if you want to move on later.
Um, so public interest law is can be super chaotic. It's the big law track. One of the merits is that it is like clearly laid out in front of you. There's like certain, there's these things called OCIs, different sort of steps that you take that are very well documented, very well regimented, very well run. Getting to a public interest career right out of law school and not going through a couple years in big law requires stitching things together. So it's being super curious and super willing to sort of sit in a space of unknowing, like anxiety when all your friends have had their jobs since the first year. So like I was coming up against my graduation. I still hadn't secured my fellowship just because of what I was interested in doing was sort of niche. And but one thing that I can say is that if you're interested in public interest law, I was like, I knew when I went into law school, I didn't want to work for a firm. I wanted to go straight through and immediately start working for an NGO or something. Is that I just did a lot of little things. And what I ended up trying to do, because it took me a while to figure out that I wanted to do like human rights and conflict and sort of state violence, was that I started visualizing it like setting a leftmost like extreme and a rightmost extreme, and then trying to do an experience at both of those extremes and seeing where it kind of like melded in the middle. So to be more concrete, my second year I did 2 internships. I did one at at UNHCR, which is like the UN's refugee agency, in a country office. So I worked internationally. I was doing like international sort of migration and human rights law. And then this other half, I was in DC working for a civil rights impact litigation firm. So like the other was like super US based, super federal, super into like the like nitty gritty of statutes. And then neither of them was for me. But what I ended up doing was like seeing where they kind of like laid into each other. And I think that produced the clarity that I needed to now pursue my fellowship year, which is sort of kind of like a finishing school. It's like an extension of law school in which you're like working, but I'm being paid by my law school actually. So my salary is set by the school and I'm working for just 1 year, which means I just started and I like immediately need to start looking for a new job, which is annoying. But it's very iterative. It's like you're bouncing off one thing to the other. And while it can create anxiety about like all your friends are like, oh, I know where I'm going, I know what I'm doing. And you're like, oh, I don't even know where I'm going to be. And the school's starting to email you like, what's up? What are you doing? Like, we need to figure out what you're doing. And it worked out, but yeah, it's a little bit more of a kind of a winding road.
Yeah, well, Nico, I will say that maybe you have the anxiety now of trying to figure it out, but your friends will have the anxiety later because most people at big law firms do panic at a certain point just because it's hard. You deal with billables, you don't always have a good work-life balance. So you kind of, what you're doing now is you're going through the reflection period of finding the overall benefits, which I think public interest law requires you to do. But it's easy to just think that like, okay, just because I'm at a firm, I'm going to have it all mapped out. But it's, it causes stress sometimes later on. Although some people do like it, but I do think there's a time in which working at big law it's not sustainable. So it's definitely possible. And I think it really gives you kind of that like hard legal skills for certain avenues or for certain years, but it's not always the most sustainable, which isn't to discourage anyone. I think if that's really what your dream is, it's okay. But I think what Nico just talked about is really important because he kind of went through the reflective period and I think and showed you how he showed you the kind of pros and cons that he was weighing out, which really is ultimately what's needed. And I think that kind of exercise is always something that you'll utilize throughout the legal field. I think the legal profession is one of the jobs that has the most change from position. So like it's pretty normal for lawyers to go from a government agency to an NGO, with administration changes or every few years, way more than I think other legal professions. But anyways, to talk about what I did. So graduating in 2020, the job market was really challenging. So I knew, like Nico, I wanted to kind of work for the good side. I didn't want to kind of have to defend Exxon or BP after the work that I was doing. So but unfortunately during 2020, a lot of jobs were just not hiring anymore. So the big environmental nonprofits just suspended hiring entirely. And a lot of government agencies like EPA and whatnot, they also just had really tight restrictions on how many applicants they could take. So NOAA for their whole kind of attorney honors program. So if you wanted to work for a federal agency, there is an honors program that gets people straight into that. But like NOAA, for example, is only hiring one person in the entire country, which I think is insane to show you just how tight that market was. So I ended up working for a firm that was in White Plains. It was commercial litigation. It was boutique for 1 year, and I got really good legal experience and training, but I definitely knew it was not what I wanted to do. And while I was working for the firm, I was editing a book at the same time. So I was kind of keeping like one foot in the environmental door. And as soon as I hit that 1 year mark, I just did everything in my power to try to get to the next step. And it was really nice to see how much feedback and response I was getting from different environmental groups, or had interviews with the EPA and with other environmental NGOs. And that really was from just 1 year of being out of law school. And that's the thing, a lot of companies don't want to hire people right out unless they're kind of going through a typical law firm recruiting phase, or if they're in the attorney general, like the honors program. So if you can just kind of get in that like 1 to 2, max 3 years, and then go into what you really care about, it will help you and serve you well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. I was wondering now if maybe any of the students on the Zoom have any questions for our panelists. I know we touched on a lot. Feel free to raise your hand, or just honestly, you can just unmute yourself and ask if you have a question.
Hi, so this is, I think, more for Nico, but how did you make the decision to do a gap year, and how did you, did you know before the gap year you wanted to do law school, or was that kind of something that happened later?
Sorry. The gap year, there was the time for me to confirm that I wanted to go to law school. So it was like very explicit in my mind that I needed to go to graduate school in some form, to do the things that I wanted to do, whether it was like in human rights policy or in practice. I didn't know what the right path was. And I was actually, there's a little piece in my mind of like, oh, maybe I still want to be a teacher, a social worker. So I had like these 4 things that every single day, one was flashing more than the other. And I was like, okay, I'm not ready to go right now. I'm also sick of being in school. I need to do something that allows me to sort of continue to this discernment process with a fixed time frame. And so JVC was like the sort of the perfect combination of factors for me, where it felt very service oriented. I'm not a religious person, but I was attracted to like kind of the ethic of it. I explicitly wanted to do something non-legal related as well. I think this was important for me because I wanted to see, okay, if by the end of a year where I'm doing something that feels closer to social work, I'm still drawn to the law, that's probably a pretty good sign that law school is my path. And that I'm not just sort of marching forward blindly because, everyone tells you, oh, like you're smart, and you're reading and writing, and you're doing this like kind of like humanities major where it's like kind of a combination of 7 other disciplines. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to like, you hear that a lot. And I was mindful of the fact that I didn't want to just sort of jump into it because I didn't know what else to do. I wanted it to be a deliberate choice. So by the time I think junior year came around, I knew I was going to take time off. And actually for a while it was Peace Corps that I thought I wanted to do. And then I generated some concerns about working for the State Department. And so JVC was the right call for me. And as I mentioned, I worked as a caseworker, immigrant caseworker. So we touch on the law. Like a lot of my clients were in immigration and deportation proceedings, and some of them had pending criminal matters and this and that. But I wasn't like working in like a law firm or for an immigration attorney. And that was very refreshing because by the time I came back to law school and I was like, yes, this is for me. I was excited to do it. I was excited to learn about it. So I highly recommend taking a year off. But I know financial situation, like JVC does not pay a lot. If you have loans, you might be able to defer them. Like, it's a privilege to be able to do it. And I'm conscious of, when I give this advice, acknowledging that not everyone's able to do it. And it was a privileged space that I was in, and I'm lucky for it. But yeah.
Any other questions?
Hi, this is more or so a question for Anxhela, but coming out of environmental law program that was pretty highly ranked, how important was it for you to access the alumni network from a program like that, where you sort of knew that was the direction you wanted to go along?
Yeah, the alumni program was great in the sense that but it started at BC for me. BC does like an Eagle Exchange mentorship program. And it was interesting because the person that I got paired with went to BC and then Pace Law. And then ended up, she works at a firm in New York doing land use law. So it was really nice having her. In terms of securing a job, I've really kind of leaned on my professors during that time of having them either send me job openings if they knew of anything. But it's nice to just see, even on LinkedIn, like if you're kind of connecting with people that have gone to your school, BC or Pace, you're just more likely to start a conversation and whatnot. So I definitely think Pace is doing better in terms of utilizing its alumni network for helping people find jobs, but that wasn't how I ended up securing my position. I think I ended up just finding it online myself. So I will say during the job hunt, it's helpful to just use LinkedIn or other resources. But if there's companies or NGOs that you want to work for, it's always great to check their own websites as well, because sometimes they won't come up through like a regular search. And that's ultimately kind of how it happened for me. But utilizing alumni, I would say, for future positions, if that was something that if I wanted to go for a change, is always a good strategy to utilize.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, if we don't have any other questions, would you guys be comfortable sharing your emails with the students, or no? It's totally okay if you don't, but if you are comfortable, you could put it in the chat, and maybe if students come up with any other questions, they can ask you guys later. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for your time today. We always love having IS alum come back, especially their previously peer advisors. So thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.